Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining this chat today. Those on YouTube watching live, those that are in the Google Hangout, and thank you, Mark, for coming here today to talk with us at Giveth. I'll let Mark kind of introduce himself and maybe take a minute or two to explain, what's going on at Mozilla. I mean, I've known Mark for a number of years, mostly from his days at telecenter.org, but he is the president and executive director of the Mozilla Foundation, kind of focusing on all things related to, keeping the internet that most valuable resource. And so beyond just looking at the Mozilla Firefox browser, also focusing on fueling the broader internet health movement, working with citizens, technologists, and civic leaders around the world. And then maybe Mark, and then for the format of this call, we've got about an hour. We have some pre-prepared questions that we've shared with Mark already, but I really want to keep it kind of informal. So I'll throw out some of those pre-prepared questions at the beginning of this chat, and then, I think things will come up, and we can take questions from the YouTube live stream and from everyone here in this channel. So maybe Mark, if you want to kind of kick things off and just kind of give us a little bit of a background of yourself and what's going on at Mozilla right now.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you, Michael. And thanks everybody for having me here. I really do want to make it a dialogue. So we'll get through those pre-planned questions, but I'm interested, through the dialogue to learn about the folks in this community, and what Giveth is all about, and kind of how we can be helpful. Michael, it's almost like you read my bio because you said what I would say about myself. And so it is indeed my role at Mozilla, and I guess probably to add a little bit of color commentary to that, and then connect us is, people often ask me, how do you become executive director of Mozilla? What's the career path? And I say, go and sign up at Stanford for a computer science degree. No, I'm not a computer scientist. I'm somebody who's been a media activist for my whole life. And the answer I give people actually is, for me, the path was punk rock and the peace movement. I started out as a teenager in Canada, as somebody who really, as punk rock and the peace movement might suggest, was growing up in the 80s and really questioning the structures of power that existed then during the Cold War, and actually then in the music industry, and always thought there's some link between questioning power and freedom and technology and communication. And so that's the thread I have pulled, and I think it's the thread many of us have pulled in the early days of the internet as a kind of tool for empowerment and a tool for opening up societies and opportunity. And I guess to where that meets Mozilla today, certainly Mozilla comes from in many ways that same history, not punk rock particularly, but the idea that we can pick up a keyboard or pick up technology and shape the world around us, and that being able to build a website or build a social network or build anything that build on the internet is something that should be available to all of us, is of that same ethos. I think many of us really felt optimistic about what world we could build from that perspective. And many of us, probably people on this call, are also have spent the last couple of years feeling we're at a moment of reckoning where that optimism and that aspiration, at least we have to, even if we remain aspirational about the human potential of technology and the democratic potential of technology, we really have to kind of look and say, oh, be careful what you wish for, because we've kind of things have gone the opposite direction in so many ways than we might have hoped, whether those are political outcomes or the kind of toxicity of online harassment or the weaponization of cyberspace and all of those kind of things. So Mozilla, we sit as so many around us at that crossroads of what do we aspire for in terms of a healthy internet, or an internet that's empowering to people, at the same time as how do we continue to aspire for that in a way that's realistic about what's going on. And so we continue to, to make Firefox obviously as the main thing that people know us for. And around the edges, we'll probably get into this in some of the questions, look at things like where does decentralized web technology fit in, and a lot of questions continue around just data and privacy and security. But Firefox is still a browser used by hundreds of millions of people. It's not going to change overnight. And so there's many things, like I think a lot of things this community is working on, that we aren't going to be at the forefront of, that are we need to figure out in terms of what how the decentralized web empowers people, how AI is going to work differently. A lot of these kind of tech questions, which Mozilla through Firefox is not going to be at the forefront of in the next 6 months or a year. And at the same time, we're at a spot as Mozilla realizing that taking society and the web in a better direction, or pushing history in a better direction, isn't going to just happen through technology. And we're really at a spot where politics comes into this in a huge way, in a way that I think people naively thought it wouldn't in the early web. And that's both bad, but also an opportunity for us to look at where's the role of citizen power, and not just to kind of programmer power in pushing things. And so the side of Mozilla that I run, which owns the Firefox side of things but doesn't operate it, is more focused on how do we build a social movement around the values of an open and healthy internet. And I can talk about specific things we're doing there, but that's sort of the kind of place that we push on, is much more the people power side of it. So there's a kind of an intro. There's lots more detail I can go into either side of it, but that kind of gets things rolling.
Yeah, awesome, Mark. And I think just for you, I mean, Griff, I think Griff can give you a good overview of where we're coming at in this sort of decentralized space, and especially related to blockchain and so forth. So I'll just pass it over to Griff, and he can kind of give us a spiel too.
Yeah, I mean, wow, that's amazing. I'm so excited to hear. I really had no idea about the social movement that Mozilla is trying to push. I mean, outside of the dev culture, obviously. I really hope that we can talk more about that. But because that's also where Giveth is coming from. Giveth is a community focused on blockchain for good, and we are fully aligned on the idea that it's more than a technological movement. Tech is relatively apolitical. It's a tool, right? A hammer can be used to build a house, or it can be used to like hit someone over the head. So it's really about making sure that we have an army of awesome soldiers that can do powerful things to protect the world with this technology and these tools. And they need training, and we need to be really smart about the cultural side of things. And so Giveth, as this community trying to integrate blockchain tech into the space to make positive outcomes, we have one main flagship product called the Giveth app. That's where we do, really we're aspiring after the Open Philanthropy model. It's of course a long time coming, and or it's going to be a long roadmap before we get anywhere near where Open Collective is, which is really a powerful tool. But as far as the blockchain tools, I feel like we've really we're setting ourselves apart from most of the space. We don't have a token. We don't do any of that stuff. We're really actually just trying to provide a service for the world and provide tools that people can use to integrate accountability and transparency into their product, into the offering that they have to their community. And we do that with the tech, but also with the community, where it's a bit dangerous to just unleash things on the world and think it's going to work out. I actually, my background, I've been in Ethereum for a while, and my first project was the DAO, which really didn't work out. So so we know firsthand how important it is. And beyond just the code having a bug, there were cultural flaws too. We really went too fast and too big too fast. And we're trying to do that the other way around this time with Giveth, where we go slow and we build a solid foundation and then start experimenting with decentralized governance. So our real motto is to build the future of giving. And there is, right now we have the solid foundation pretty much built. We're merging our last big feature release changes the smart contracts probably for the last time, and we're about to start really onboarding projects and improving the user experience and learning how people really want to use this tool that we built. But now that we have this solid foundation where it's really easy to do cryptographic traceable donations, we can build something really important off of that. The tool that we have now honestly doesn't need a blockchain. An open database would work great. And I think that most charities, and large charities especially, would like to do traceable donations. But at the same time, there's some things that make it not really effective. In general, the system of the charity space has a lot of flaws. The biggest one being the people who donate suffer and everyone else wins, right? There's huge incentive misalignments there. On top of that, you build these large corporate entities that they're designed to survive, right? This is the system that they're built. They need to thrive. They need to make sure that they can continue extracting value out of the systems to continue their own process. This is important, and it's what needs to happen. But at the same time, it's flawed, and because there are some results of that. Like in general, the corporate charities don't necessarily want to connect it's not in their advantage to connect the donors directly to the people who are receiving the funds, because then they're out of that stream, and that's a systemic failure. And on the worst systemic failure is the ethical dilemma that comes with potentially solving the problem. And it's so hard because you have so many good people working in a flawed system that want to solve an issue. But if that issue ever gets solved, a CEO like yourself, if you ever just solve the internet's issues, all of them are perfect, you would end up having to lay off your entire staff, right? And now that's not something that's going to stop you, but why should you be working against the system? Why should it be that when you win, you lose? And we believe we're really just about to start building economies around the commons, around the common good, and realign incentives with economic models. And we can do this with cryptocurrencies. There's a magic thing that these cryptographic economies allow us with smart contracts. They allow us to actually simulate and test how these economies will run. And that's not something that you could do before. In the general economy, you have this system where anything is possible. And then a regulatory agency says, no, you can't do X, Y, Z. Probably like ABC all the way to, or way beyond hex, that's for sure. But if they actually, in smart contract systems, you give people a currency and you can only do what the contracts say you can do. And with that model, you can simulate complex economies, and you can ensure that this system has all the incentives aligned so that when people act in their own best interest, it helps the underlying commons. And that's the real goal. And with the Giveth DApp as it is, we believe that we can start experimenting with systems above it that align incentives properly so that whenever someone acts in their own self-interest, it keeps the system going and fuels the system. And I can go into that more. I kind of went on a rant there because I'm actually at the systems designer's house right now, Block Science. So I'm really in this space. We're building out these incentive structures this weekend or this week. So, but I think I went on a little tangent there about what Giveth is about. So I'll just pass it back.
It helps me give more informed answers. So thank you, Griffith. It's super interesting.
Yeah.
And you're right. We can go right into the center of the fact that my incentive is to keep this big thing going. And so where is decentralization kind of fit into the picture of kind of social transformation?
I think it's going to be core. Personally.
Well, let's see. I hope so. Kind of how do we keep it? I mean, it's interesting. Michael, I've seen the question, so I can kind of jump into.
Yeah, go for it.
Riffing off of what Griff said. and then thinking metaphorically about the DAO, or like the general kind of idea you're talking about. Mozilla really started as an autonomous organization, or a kind of decentralized organization in a certain way, not in the specific way that you're talking about. But it's really interesting that people don't know the history, because it's a story of the creation of something in that spirit, and then actually some of the contradictions of success. Where it's really actually hard to kind of maintain that decentralized spirit, and it's a big part of where we go in and out of different waves. And so, for people who don't know the history, the Netscape, which of course people do know, was the first big commercial browser, and was the only real player for a long time, and Microsoft had sort of said, this web thing, it's not going to take off. When in the early days of Netscape, 94, 95, Microsoft even had a sort of a counter standard to HTML. It wasn't even like a fork of HTML. It was sort of like, we're going to do this hypertext thing. It's going to go somewhere, but we're going to do a thing inside of Windows called Blackbird. And they realized that the web was what headed somewhere, and so they built a browser, and they did blend it into the operating system, and they went from 0 to 98% market share in basically 5-6 years. And so they went from ignoring this big decentralized force to completely re-centralizing it, including taking effectively at that point forking HTML and proposing ActiveX as opposed to JavaScript as the way to create interaction on the web, and really trying to kind of control this thing that had kind of got loose from them as the people who really owned mainstream computing on the planet at the time. And Netscape, of course, was a victim, or a kind of loser in that battle, because obviously if they go from 100% market share to 2% market share, that it's, as a public company, that's not great for you. But you also had people who were working at Netscape, including people like Brendan Eich, who was one of the Mozilla founders, and who invented, one of the key inventors of JavaScript, who really were, and Mitchell Baker, who's our remaining founder of Mozilla and who was a lawyer at Netscape, who really were true believers in the web as a decentralized technology. And for them, taking it back and keeping it in the hands of technologists and of the people and the public was their primary goal, and not shareholder value. And so in 1998, through a funny story, which I can tell when we're not on YouTube, and over a beer at some point, if any of us end up in the pub somewhere, Netscape, which hadn't fully lost all that market share, but was declining, decided to open source the Netscape code, which a public company had never done anything like that. This is the core asset of a very commercial business. And it's hard to imagine now when free software underpins most of what we do, but it was a radical idea. Pardon?
Did Brendan Eich have a say in that movement to decentralize, or who really made that call? Because that's a ballsy call.
Well, the open sourcing part of it was one of the VPs at Netscape, who's still on our board, Bob Lisbon, who ran the consumer browser piece, and ultimately convincing Jim Clark, who was the CEO, to do it. And
I mean, that's just a heroic move. It sounds like actually a historical pivotal point.
It was a pivotal point, but then I think that the growth of the decentralized organization after that is an interesting story for you guys. And so there was them who made it, but I don't know if Brendan was in the room, but certainly Mark Andreessen and Eric Raymond and all of these kind of like the free software. I think probably Brian Behlendorf at Apache, who's on our board still. We're talking about this as an idea, as a way to kind of, and so there was a lot of people who are free software and open source luminaries and activists, and it probably, I don't know if Linus was a part of all this, but these people, it was a small community at the time, and they said, look, let's do this, and they sold it to the CEO because they felt like they had nothing to lose. And what what's the interesting thing in terms of the history of decentralized organizations about that is not just the open sourcing of that's a historical pivot point, as you mentioned, Griff, but that the company continued for 4 or 5 years to try to develop Netscape with the theory that others would develop the underlying technology and fork and use the underlying technology, and that would lower the cost or increase the velocity of innovation and allow them to take back space from Microsoft and for the kind of core web standards, which Brendan was a big champion of, to kind of regain the field. And of course, that never happened. AOL buys Netscape and they shut it down. It never happened at Netscape, but it did happen. And you know what it was is the Mozilla organization, as it would have, you know, just Mozilla.org, really formed in many ways in opposition to or very separate from Netscape. And so for 5 years, it didn't have a corporate entity. A lot of people inside Netscape worked on the project, including Brendan and Mitchell. But it was just hackers and developers in many companies and individuals around the world, people who, you know, did it off the side of their desk from Sun and IBM, and just individuals, people in universities. And so Mozilla had to develop a governance system, and in fact, by design, developed a governance system that was very protective of the independence of developers from Netscape. And so that if you kind of go read about the Mozilla module owner system and the Mozilla governance model, which still is, at least in theory, in place today, you know, you didn't have people inside the company making decisions about who got to commit. You had you know, what at least at the time might have been seen as a genuine meritocracy. You had a very distributed leadership system broken down by, you know, different modules within the software. And for non-software stuff like branding, that was in place.
When the governance system was implemented, was there a legal entity for Mozilla, or was it no? That's amazing.
That's what I'm saying. It was really invented to create an authority structure and a decision-making structure outside of the legal entity, and so operated for 5 years without a legal entity, and really, in many ways, I wouldn't say in opposition to Netscape, but you know, Netscape was trying to figure out in its final gasp how to make money, and it was not interested in this. And so it really was a voluntary community with a published and real governance system. The only thing they were governing was decisions over what code got checked in. You know, it had all of the things, like there were peers inside of each module who would work with the module owner, but he or she, mostly he, would have, you know, final decision-making authority, you know, all of the things that are normal in free software, code review, and so on. You know, we're all open and transparent, and anyone could see what was happening, how the decisions were made. So that, you know, that decentralized approach was at the heart of what helped Mozilla build a vibrant community behind the software part of what we did. Because the people had a holy mission, which was beat Microsoft. So the goal was clear, and they had a working, transparent, decentralized structure in the pursuit of that goal. And it, you know, it's fairly easy to measure whether you're succeeding with that goal. Like, are more people using the software? Does the software run? So, you know, I think decentralized, effective, high-impact decentralized systems often work best when you have those conditions. You have a clear goal. You have a clear way to measure whether you're succeeding towards that goal and determine whether somebody's contribution is helpful or not helpful. I think decentralized systems are often, of that nature anyways, less successful with fuzzy problems. They're better with, in my experience, with clear problems.
Yeah, and clear metrics. And congratulations, you definitely beat Internet Explorer.
Well, I didn't do anything. I came well after that.
Yeah. But then Chrome came in. Sorry, Michael, unless you want to do it.
No, not at all. Go ahead.
Because, I mean, there was a while where Mozilla was the best browser, right?
Yeah.
Like, it was, I mean, and had a clear market share. But then Chrome came in, and where would you say you know, how did you guys end up losing that title? And Yeah, what would you say? Or where, and also where were the flaws? You know, like you had a solid decentralized system with people that were really focused and you know, dedicated to the cause. Where did it end up falling off?
Yeah, well, those are all great questions and sort of like different paths to follow. So maybe I'll pick one and then bring me back to the other ones. And so, you know, what happens after that is there's enough success. Well, actually, even before there's success, there is a sense after AOL is about to shut down Netscape that there's enough potential. So it's not actually about enough success. There's enough potential, which I think you often see even in the stuff you guys are talking about, where the potential means that people are willing to put in resources beyond their own time. And as people are willing to put in their resources beyond their own time, you know, as you say, you know, you need typically corporate structures to accept those resources. And so, you know, the nonprofit Mozilla Foundation gets created in 2003, so 5 years after the project begins, as a way to hold intellectual property and accept money and employ people. And so, you know, and at that point, it is still just potential. You have a whole other, we won't go down that side story now, but a whole other fight between the people who are trying to keep pushing on the browser as it was, which was a suite with email and news groups and a web authoring tool, and people who decided they wanted to pursue a simpler browser that was faster, that was stripped down, which became Firefox eventually. So even inside of that container, there, you know, there's conflict. But at that point, you know, the legal entity is created, but it's the decision making really around the software remains in that decentralized governance system, and the, you know, the organization works well, I think, just to kind of support that. But you know, a number of things change over time. I think that to give ourselves and others, I mean, Wikipedia kind of still struggles on with this pressure, I think, as a very decentralized system in some more ways than Mozilla. But the pressures are the same, which is the pendulum swings back from open to closed, decentralized to centralized in terms of who has power. So in some ways, we and the web developers of the world, or Mozilla, I wasn't there at the time, you know, seize back some of the power from Microsoft. But then that openness that created is seized by Google and eventually Facebook to innovate and re-centralize and take back power. And you know, you tend to often have this pendulum swing. You know, I like to wish it isn't so, and it's more complicated than that, but certainly that's a part of what goes on. And so in the case of Chrome, it really was just the Google, who was also our business partner. I mean, that, for people who don't know, that's where most of Mozilla's revenue comes from, is search advertising. You know, mostly Google, for a period Yahoo, also some of the international big search engines. You know, they just decide they don't have enough control over the web, which is their primary source of revenue, and they invest in building a browser, and they put more money in it. I mean, at the peak of early market share acquisition, Chrome was spending, I don't know how much the numbers are trumped up, but you know, 5 to 10 times as much on marketing as Mozilla was spending on engineering. You know, you would go, you know, you would go into like the subway in London and see the whole platform covered in Chrome ads for a period of time, and that was their, you know, that was the pivot point. Is they and of course they used the fact that they had the search engine to suggest, hey, this might be better with Chrome. So I mean, they had their own marketing channels that were dominant. So even if we had done everything right, really the issue was just a wealthy, centralized competitor came and kind of seized away the control that Firefox, you know, or the kind of space that Firefox had taken up, and we didn't do everything right. So, you know, on top of that, we decided that I rightly determined that the next point of control over digital life would be the smartphone, and tried to build a smartphone operating system saying, well, we're fine in the browser, we have enough market share to control it, let's go build Firefox OS, which many people may not remember. And we took our eye off the ball of the browser, and like everybody else, we completely failed to grab hold in smartphones, which is also true of Nokia, and is also true of Microsoft, and ultimately even BlackBerry. So the fact that we lost in that, we're in, I don't know, a good company, but we're in a significant company. But we kind of then looked up at the end of the day as we're not going to succeed in smartphones, and we haven't been paying enough attention to the browser technically, and we were in trouble. And so to the credit of the people Mark Mayo, who runs Firefox, and Chris Beard and Danelle Dixon-Thayer, who run the business side, they really kind of brought Firefox back to the point where it's stable and better and whatever. But the world has moved on, right? It's not even the smartphone, which is the point of power or control. Now it's who has the data and who's got enough of the AI, and is the decentralized web and the blockchain able to disrupt that? And we're not really big players in the Firefox world in those questions, if I'm honest. And that's one reason why the kind of social movement side of it is interesting, because we can push on those topics with something else, and not just with technology.
Mark, just a question then around the Google kind of relationship you have with Mozilla. Is it still the case that Google is one of your primary funders of the foundation? And if so, how do you reconcile what you just said about Google, and in a sense, part of keeping the web open is sort of kind of trying to decentralize some of those silos that are out there, and yet Google in a way is one of those silos that is potentially providing funding to Mozilla. So how do you reconcile that aspect within Mozilla, and how do you kind of keep that independence, I guess?
Yeah, it's not even in a way that's the case. It is the case that Google is one of those the problems in terms of where the internet, I would say, society is, and realistically, the browser and the revenue stream that supports the development of Firefox grew around search. And so we tried to find an alternate partner in Yahoo, who really, Marissa Meyer did want to help them come back as a second independent player in search, and they didn't succeed. And so we did take a bet on them to try to operate separately from Google, and it didn't work, right? And so the choices are find a new business model, which I think is one of the things we're working on, or take the revenue to zero. So it kind of comes to some of Griff's points, but that means stop making a browser and going from 25% or 30% market share down to 15, which is where it's gone, down to 0 or 1%. And so there's a question of how do you hold on to your relevance? And I think we have a very good track record of operating independently and collaboratively and in conflict even with Google. I mean, this stuff happens on so many layers, right? It happens in the web standards layer, it happens in competition for users, it happens in the data layer. I mean, if people are watching, one of the things that we're exploring is advanced tracking protection in Firefox, which would really kind of blow up a lot of the ad model for people who want to opt out of tracking in a more extreme way on a day-to-day level, and that probably wouldn't be good for our Google revenue, and wouldn't be good for Google or Facebook or whoever. But it's the kind of stuff that we're willing to explore. So I think there's tensions in all of that, but one of the things that stands out in Mozilla's history is a kind of balance between values and pragmatism. I kind of always say you always need a Malcolm X and a Martin Luther King to make civil rights happen, who come with very different approaches. And not to say that open source is as important as civil rights, but certainly important. And you need a Richard Stallman and you need a Mitchell Baker. You need people who are going to be purists and you need people who are going to be pragmatists. And so I think if you think about the Google relationship as one of the many, it's fraught, but it's also something we're open about and work on the tensions with all the time. And comes from a very pragmatic place, including a pragmatic place, which is, it's really interesting for various reasons. I had to go back in and read all the bugs where they decided to make Google the default search engine in the early days of Firefox in 2003, because we needed to make an argument about how we made that choice, right? That it wasn't a choice that was made by Google asking us to, which it wasn't at the time. And if you go read the bugs, they're arguing which search engine to use, and Google's becoming the big one, even though in 2003 it was nothing. And people, yeah, but that's what people use, right? It's what people want. And so if you're going to be pragmatic about creating technology that people are going to use, you have to meet them where they are at some level. And that's the role of leadership in this stuff, is where do you build in the values in a way that is compatible with what people are going to actually use?
Absolutely.
One other thing, Mark, just on the community side of Mozilla, because, we've been talking a lot about Firefox, but Mozilla has, and I think especially since you've joined, you've kind of created this huge open source community that's developing all sorts of tools and getting to all sorts of different spaces with your, I think there was a 10,000 Mozillian kind of idea. And it does seem like you've got this massive community around the Mozilla Foundation. And just curious on how, we just a lot of us came from Ethereum Denver, where there was hundreds of hackers building different blockchain applications and stuff. How did that form that, sort of changed the focus a little bit, just from, being around the browser to creating this entire ecosystem of people and organizations supporting the Mozilla cause?
Well,
and what could we learn from that as Giveth, kind of a decentralized community, not a corporation, not incorporated, but kind of building on that kind of model too?
Well, I think a couple of things. One is there still are thousands of people, probably not that whole 10,000. That 10,000 goes up and down as an estimate. There's well more than 10,000 people doing stuff with us, and well less than 10,000 who are the core volunteers. But we've done research on this in the last couple of years, and there's still a lot of people who voluntarily work on Firefox. It's more centralized in terms of the decision making, and I think ultimately more corporate on that side of the house. I mean, we don't directly, as the foundation, run that, and they believe they've had to be in order to compete against the 3 or 4 other browsers, I think how you count it. But regardless of whether you agree or disagree with sort of where they've gone or how they've made their comeback plays, there's still a lot of volunteers who work on Firefox because it's interesting. It's what open source is always at its best, right? It's interesting. It's a place to learn. It's a place to scratch an itch. All those things. And so it remains an open source project at pretty significant level, and the level of volunteer contribution remains the same. It's very hard compared to the original days to be an open source volunteer contributor and actually have an effect on the direction of the product. And that's the major difference. But the numbers of people I don't think have gone down. If anything, they've gone up. And then, the other area of growth is a little bit more traditional movement building stuff. And so it's either, we spent a lot of time, or stuff that I had done for a lot of time, focus on digital literacy and getting people to volunteer to go out and teach coding and stuff to other people. And so, that was one piece where, volunteer education is a very traditional kind of nonprofit activity that we spent a lot of time and got thousands and thousands of people around the world involved in. And now it's more around political activism of getting people to push on the companies to treat our data in a certain way, or getting people to organize local campaigns, or getting sets of innovators together who want to kind of work on alternatives. And that's more, I think, traditional community organizing. So all those models have been there, and a number of others that are not that different than what you would go and study in a modern book about organizing communities, right? Whether it's open source, or whether it's education, or whether it's activism, giving people, it goes back to the thing I said earlier about what worked in the early decentralized day, giving people, or people coming together with a very clear target and a real clear place of where they're going, and giving them the ways to participate in the pursuit of that target, and then over time giving them authority on retargeting or redefining participation. I mean, those are the places where it works. And where you have sort of an open-ended set of questions, or whatnot, it's you get less of that. So most those are the, I still say, like Firefox and teaching, which is no longer a focus of ours, and activism are the three things that have kind of drawn people in.
I just wanted to, sorry, go ahead, Griff.
Well, just like you said, it's so important to be able to align people around an idea, right? Like, it's really hard to organize if everyone's kind of going in their own way. Some people want to fix bugs, some people with this, but if you have like clear set of values and a mission that people are aware of and they can sign up for, it's like its own little alignment within the decentralized community.
Yeah, and it's a good topic, and you're right. Like the Mozilla Manifesto, which only came 10 years into the project, so it came in 2007, really, as a written down, codified set of values, does keep people together. It's worth, at least that's my opinion in any case, thinking about whether that core set of values keeps people together or brings people to the table. And I think it tends to be useful in keeping people together. The values themselves don't bring in new recruits. I think people don't come in unless there's something exciting to do, or some exciting enemy to fight, or some exciting world to save, or values don't actually motivate action. I think they bond people. And so my experience in 10 years with Mozilla is that the Mozilla Manifesto actually does create a space for fairly independent action. I can be working on Firefox, I can be working on activism, or I can be trying to start some new VR thing under the Mozilla banner over here. And people will really quite genuinely harken back to those values and see them as a guiding force and a container. But I don't think they grow, in my experience, they don't grow community. So I would separate those things out. And I'll also say, to go a little bit back to the question of now, what's Mozilla doing? The last couple of years had to really put our values under a lot of pressure, because if you go back to read the original manifesto, which is of course still there and still our core guiding set of values, it talks about a lot of things that feel really wonky and crazy 10, 15 years ago. What's 2007, 11 years ago? Like, hey, that we should all have control over our own internet experience, or the internet is a part of the fabric of everyday life. It talks about things like that, which 2007 maybe felt like a bit of a stretch, but are now just like so evidently true. But the core values are like open source, privacy, collaboration. It's kind of a still, it's not fully techno-libertarian, but it's kind of the optimistic open source privacy view of what to stand for, which makes sense in 2007. And of course, we have stood for that, and so many people have stood for that, and we've actually gotten a lot of that. And we've gotten fucked up democracies, and online harassment, and centralization of power. And even if those values still were in many ways the ones that we stand for and have had some success in the world, things haven't worked out how we hoped. So we actually added 4 new clauses to the manifesto and had to go through a whole exercise of reevaluating our values over the last couple of years. And it's not, we didn't change those, we still stand on those, but we extended them to say, and you really need to imagine an internet that doesn't discriminate on who people are, and you need to imagine an internet that lends itself to critical thinking and human dignity, and sort of these more human values have to be a part of what bonds us together if we want to build the digital world we want. So that's kind of interesting, is the values have kept us together and we've had to go back and reflect on them.
Great. I just wanted to open it up. Is there anyone else in either the YouTube stream or else here in the Hangouts, if anyone wants to ask a question for Mark? Feel free to jump in. If not, oh, Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious how the process of reassessing the values went down. How did you close that loop or reiterate, so to speak? Because I can imagine that'd be quite a contentious, tension-causing process, potentially.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's a good question. And it's in some ways, points to the fact that at least on some level, the original governance system is still operating. The original governance system, which was called modular ownership, or the core principle was modular ownership. Like I said before, somebody owns a security module, and somebody owns the rendering engine, and somebody owns the brand, and they blow up. At the top of that, despite it being a decentralized system that anyone can pitch into, and in theory a meritocracy, it was also a hierarchical system that is, if you're own the security module and you want to check something into the release of the browser, it still has to go to the person who owns the browser as the module owner. And it was originally Brendan and Mitchell, and now it's only Mitchell. There were 2 owners of the module owner system. Basically people who owned governance. So, I mean, I probably shouldn't say this on a public YouTube channel, but in some ways it's sort of like if you have the sovereign, right? And eventually, if the House of Commons can't agree, the sovereign can dissolve Parliament and reform Parliament. And so you kind of have the original founders in that role, which is almost never exercised, and in this case, not exercised in that way. But in Mitchell's case in particular, I mean, having known her for 10 years, she does feel really responsible that things are going well. So she led a process, she instigated and led a process, which was, at the time felt way too long, and took a year to reflect on what's missing from the manifesto. And so as the owner of that piece of code, the manifesto, it's one of the few things she owns directly. She led a long consultative, discursive process on what's missing. And of course, you would have many of the things you would expect as we think about values in the internet in, at that time, 2017, I guess, early 2018 it finished. I don't know, late 2017, early 2018 finished. So through, say, 2016, 2017 was the conversation. You have people who go the internet is full of harassment and we need to shut down the bad guys and it's undermining democracy, and what you might think of as a fairly left-wing set of opinions. And you have another set of opinions that may be true, but we need free speech and we can't prescribe values, and the world is diverse and people have different values and different cultures. And so the exercise of bringing together those 4 additions to the manifesto was actually an exercise in driving a dialogue between a very divergent set of people and coming up with language that satisfied all but the most extreme voices in that conversation. Someone should go back and do a little sort of anthropology reconstruction of that process, because it drove me nuts, but I think it was actually quite excellent in retrospect.
Yeah, and we have to respect that decentralized governance is still a very young science, and if you actually want to get things done, a benevolent dictator is sadly often the best form of governance that we have.
It always goes that way. It's all decentralization always ends with a benevolent dictator.
Yeah. If you want to be productive, it sucks, but hopefully there'll be a lot of experimentation, in the next 10 years. We'll have structures that actually do work reliably.
So somebody else had another question, I think, and we've got time maybe for
yeah.
Yeah, so I had a question, and it's linked to this very much about this decentralized aspect. So I read on your Wikipedia page so that you're very much involved in everything that is the concept of open philanthropy, and effective altruism. So my question is, especially when you think about what the Mozilla Foundation is doing, supporting nonprofits, do you see an evolution in like how are they more open to having this open source culture and a more decentralized spirit? Do you see an evolution since like you started this because you read a manifesto about this? You wrote a manifesto with some people about this. I saw at some point.
So are you saying, do I see philanthropy changing in that way?
Yeah, because that is actually exactly what we are trying to do in many different ways at Giveth. We believe in this transparency and accountability, that this really is an aspect that will benefit the people in the end.
So I mean, if I think about, that was like 10 or 12 years ago that I was working on that kind of investigation of open philanthropy, and it's what led me to Mozilla. And in many ways, I kind of work on an example of it, and work in the philanthropic community a lot. But I think that abstract concept isn't necessarily my kind of day-to-day thought pattern. So if I think back to that, and I think about how the last 10 years have kind of poked at that, there probably were two concepts that my nose was following. One is, to kind of use open source approaches and decentralize philanthropy, which in the literal sense that you are either talking about. And I would say, and if not decentralized, at least make transparent and whatever. And I would say that the only two people I think have made any real progress of that are the Open Technology Fund, which some of you may know. It funds a lot of security stuff. It does fund a lot of blockchain stuff. Is also mostly funded by the State Department indirectly. It's an interesting thing. But great people and very transparent processes, and you can see really who got accepted and rejected and how, and then the Shuttleworth Foundation, which has applied it in different ways and comes from open source money, and requires, I helped build some of that, like a lot of stuff around requiring open licensing from the get-go and having fairly transparent communication channels and all that sort of stuff. But even them, they haven't gone as far as you're proposing to go, and they're still effectively institutional philanthropists. I guess in some ways you could say that things like Kickstarter were a part, they didn't exist 10 years ago, are a part of a different kind of open sourcing of philanthropy. Certainly they take away the idea that you only donate, and I think it's probably more like some of the kind of back me program or platforms, but that you only donate for a tax receipt, but there's risk-based stuff and buying stuff. So those things have changed. I would say the place where I'm more, which was the other thread I was following, more optimistic, or I've just seen more change, is people pursuing traditional philanthropic topics or topics that are not market topics with open source as an approach, as opposed to philanthropy as an approach. So one thing is that opening up philanthropy, the other is like pursuing social good through open source as opposed to philanthropy. And so I think, open science and open educational content and those things, but science and education being legitimate charitable purposes, right, or legitimate philanthropic activities that individuals and foundations have spent money on for the last century and a bit in the West, or longer, I guess, if you think about charitable law over 200-300 years. you've seen shared collaborative decentralized labor as an alternative to philanthropic giving in some of those spaces. And that's still, even now, very contested and not fully successful. But I think in science and education, you've seen some success. The interesting thing there is I haven't really seen it work with stuff other than where there's like tangible material digital products. And so that's an interesting question of like, does open source work for other things, right? Like, an open body of scientific research is different in the specifics than code, but is actually not that different in type than code. And an open textbook is not that different in type than code. Whereas like fixing a rainforest, like, is there an open source approach to that? I don't know. Right?
This is exactly what Giveth is setting its sights on right now, is bringing it out to the real world. Blockchain tech so far has done such an amazing job at incentivizing behavior in the digital space, where like Bitcoin incentivizes people to run a client. I assume, are you familiar with Namecoin?
No.
No? Namecoin is the first fork of Bitcoin, and it's really interesting because no one uses it, but it's still alive. They do a decentralized domain registration, and this is the first fork of Bitcoin, and it was very innovative, where anyone can register a .bit domain. Of course, you have to go into the DNS settings of the browser and like change everything so you can actually see a .bit domain, but you can register it using this blockchain, right? And they've aligned incentives such that even though no one uses this, no one, I mean, seriously, there's like no users, it still survives. It still pushes forward. Because they've aligned the incentives such that every individual participating in the system, when they act in their own self-interest, actually propagates the system. And this is seen in Primecoin, where they just guess random prime numbers, and that's how you mint the next Primecoin. And CureCoin, Folding Coin are a little more altruistic in that you give your computing power for those currencies, and then researchers use that computing power to fold and unfold proteins for cancer research, right? And now the mission is, how do we take these incentive models that are aligning everyone around a common good out of the digital space and into saving the rainforest and these kinds of altruistic causes that need the alignment around the incentive structure, so that every actor acting in their self-interest actually pushes forward saving the rainforest. And we're really excited. This is our main project for the year, and we're very deep in it. So I'll definitely try to keep you up to date on where we're going if that interests you.
Yeah, no, I'd be interested to see where it goes for sure. Unfortunately, I have somebody yelling at me to get into another video call, but really a pleasure to meet all you folks. And I would love to hear Michael or Griff or whoever how things unfold.
Yeah, thank you very much on behalf of Giveth. Thank you for taking the time out today. And yeah, maybe Mark, if we have a chance at some point, I know you're busy now, to maybe Griff and you could have a follow-up at some point.
Sounds good. All right, have a great day, folks.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Yep.
Bye.
Thank you, guys. Nice work, Michael.